Welcome back to many of you. For those of you joining us for the first time, I'm Maggie Mahan, the Assistant Director for Community Engagement with the State Historical Society of Missouri. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. As the Associate Director of the Cape Girardeau Research Center, Bill Eddleman presents the 7th installment in his Beginning Genealogy Workshop series. Today's program will focus on using court records to reveal your family history. If you need to catch up on previous installments of this series or would like to rewatch any of the segments, you can view them on demand on the State Historical Society of Missouri's website at shsmo.org. All events in our virtual programming series are made possible thanks to the generous support of the State Historical Society of Missouri's members and donors. Thank you. You can visit our website to learn more and see how you can add or renew your support. Thank you again for joining us. Now I will turn things over to Bill.
All right, thanks, Maggie. Today's topic on court records is something that, we're getting into an area where a relatively small percentage of family historians actually bother to go to court records, but these can be incredibly rewarding and you can get an incredible amount of detail on the lives of your ancestors by using these records. They're a little bit tougher to access, and you have to understand a bit about the court system of the state you're researching, but rewards are awaiting you. Okay. Well, today's talk is on using court records to reveal your family history. And you can use these, amazingly enough, without having a law degree, if you just understand a few things and do a little bit of background research on the court system of the state you're interested in. So a little bit about court. Court day was a big deal for a lot of our ancestors. When you think about most of our ancestors lived in rural areas, and court was usually in the county seat, and it happened maybe once every 3 months. If it's circuit court, maybe once every 4 months. And so it was an excuse for people to come into town. And so when all these people are coming into town, what else happens? Well, entrepreneurs think, I can sell things to people, or a lot of times families think, well, I can catch up with my relatives or my friends. And so court day was a big social event, and actually looking at some of the court proceedings as well, if they were really juicy items, was quite an event as well. You might have street preachers preaching a sermon. You might have, again, people selling refreshments or produce, and people just catching up. And sometimes folks would camp out. It might be several day session, and they just camp or stay in a boarding house or stay with friends and just spend the whole time at the big social event that was court day. There's a lot of information you can glean from court records, and some of these, especially beginning family historians, may think, well, what good is that? Well, usually you'll find jury lists, that is, lists of men who were assigned jury duty. And typically, that was another thing. If you happen to be in town, you were liable to be grabbed for jury duty. It's not like today where you get notified in advance by phone call or email that, hey, you've been drawn for jury duty. It was just, all right, go get me 12 guys out on the lawn of the courthouse and we'll make them the jury. So you might know that your ancestor was at a certain place at a certain time. Road orders, more about that in a minute. Probate records, which I'm going to go into much more detail in the presentation number 8 next time. Guardianships, where children were lost either one or both parents and had a guardian appointed for them. Depositions, which might reveal relationships that elucidate the situation regarding a court case. Naturalizations, adoptions, although you don't see a lot about adoptions early. I think adoption was a lot more informal event when you get back 200 years ago. Apprenticeships, which usually involve some trade of money and services in order to provide an apprenticeship for a young person. Dates of residence, if your ancestors appearing in court records, whatever the reason, you know they were there and you know when they were there. Insight into personal traits, and we'll see an example of that later. Vital records, occasionally you may see something about a marriage date, for example, if somebody's providing a deposition for whatever reason. Occupations, a lot of times that would be listed after the person's name if they were sworn to give testimony. Delinquent taxes, these oftentimes had to go to the court to be endorsed, and then the court would order a sale of the land to pay the taxes. Crimes, obviously, although the really juicy stuff was relatively rare. It was usually crimes were things like trespass, which is we think of it as I set foot on somebody's property, but trespass has a broader definition, especially early. Appointments to public office for offices that weren't elective. Debts. Usually you'd sue somebody to collect a debt back in those days. You didn't work through a bank to borrow money. You borrowed money from individuals. And if you didn't pay it, according to the agreement that you had with them, you would be sued for debt potentially. Licenses, there were certain types of activities like operating ferries or sometimes selling liquor or operating a mill or any number of things that required licenses depending on the law of the time. And then divorce, which many people, a lot of people swear that there must have been a divorce since they can't find a spouse, but it's actually kind of rare, but when you do find it, it's quite a big deal in these circuit court records. A little bit more about jury lists and road orders. Here's a list of jurors for court, and they might have several juries for different trials. And you might see names repeated from one trial to the other if they didn't overlap in time. You may see the same surnames repeated, different individuals from the same family if they just happen to be in town for court. But you'll see those listed in the minutes usually. And then road orders, a lot of people don't think about how roads were done early in the Republic, but the way that operated is the county would decide a lot of times for whatever reason, or someone would petition the county for a road from point A to point B. And if the court approved it, they would appoint some individual that lived along that route as the overseer of the road. And then they would order other individuals that lived along the road to work on the road. And if you didn't do that, you were heavily fined. You might even be jailed if you didn't work on the road. So, when you get right down to it, I'm happy to pay taxes to build roads today because I don't know anything about maintaining a road, and I'm glad I don't get drafted to do that. And laying out a road may be clearing brush, it may be shoveling gravel or shoveling dirt, and it was really not easy work. And they tended to just kind of maybe veer off the route that was set up a little bit, whatever the easiest route was. But these were in the court minutes. Generally, there are three types of cases in courts, plus one other thing that might be in certain types of courts. There were violations of law that harmed individuals. So if I owe somebody money and they sue for debt, that's a violation of the law involving payment of debts. Trespass is the same way. So you can prove that it harms the person that lent the money or that owned the property that was trespassed against. Then there were violations of law that can harm society, things like murder, embezzlement, counterfeiting. The actual harm party there is society as a whole. Obviously, the murdered person was harmed, but those sort of things are against usually the highest level of law. Disputes between individuals, and those are typically called courts of equity or courts of chancery, or they were tried in some jurisdictions in circuit court sitting in chancery. These are situations where somebody thought they were treated unfairly. And a lot of times they might involve estates. So this sibling thinks, you know, I got the short end of the stick when they settled the estate. I'm going to sue the administrator of the estate because I don't think I was treated fairly. And so chancery cases can oftentimes be really valuable for proving relationships. And then additionally, especially in Missouri, where we early on had county courts, which are now county commissions, county courts served administrative functions from the very beginning of the state. And so that's why they existed, and that's why county commissions exist now, just to run the county. One of the first things you need to do if you're going to researching court records is learn how the courts are organized. And these can vary in the same place depending on the time period we're talking about. So in some of the original 13 colonies, there were colonial courts initially. In some areas that became states after the Constitution was ratified, such as Missouri, until they became a state, they would be organized and there were, as a territory, and there would be territorial courts, which would have potentially a different structure than the colonial court might have had. And then finally, at statehood, U.S. courts, and before statehood, U.S. courts had jurisdiction in U.S. territory. So we all probably have at least a little bit of a concept of the national U.S. court system, where at the top you have the Supreme Court, state courts of appeals, federal courts of appeals below that, and court of military appeals if it's in the military. Court of claims also goes to the Supreme Court, and court of international trade, which are usually don't think about those when you think of genealogy. State appeals courts might be below that. In the federal realm, you have also had U.S. federal district courts at the bottom level. And then finally, local trial courts plug into the federal system if a case goes beyond that. But depending on the state we're talking about, they're not all the same. The structure varies. There are some basics that may be the same from state to state, but many states have a lot of variation in the specifics. So at the least, there's usually state level courts, county level courts, and there may be lower level courts, like say traffic court that's municipal in nature. So here's an example where we have Alabama. Supreme Court of Alabama, you can appeal from the Court of Civil Appeals, Criminal Appeals, or Intermediate Appellate Courts. And then below that, there's circuit courts. Circuit court, and in most situations still happens, used to be, you know, the judge would ride a circuit on a horse. Now the judge may drive the circuit, but circuits may not correspond to counties, or they may correspond to counties. So you have to learn that about your state. Where do you find the circuit court records? And usually in Missouri, they stayed at the county level. Even though they may be several counties part of one circuit, the records for that county stayed at the county level. Then below that, depending on the state, you had probate courts at various times. Oftentimes circuit courts could act as probate courts in certain situations if the probate court wasn't sitting at that time. There might be district courts like in Alabama, and there are municipal courts in Alabama. So again, you have to learn this to know what records there might be and where they might be kept. A good place to go for a lot of this is Family Search, the wiki. You can look for U.S. court system info. You can go to individual states as well. And it's going to tell you the basics and probably also give you some links to how to get to some of the records, especially if they've been microfilmed by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. All right, another example, and I got to play favorites because we're Missouri State Historical Society of Missouri, so I'm always going to talk about Missouri examples. Missouri's, and again, I'm going to get into more detail here about not only the court, but where the records, you would find the records. So the Supreme Court of Missouri was created in 1820 by the first Missouri Constitution. Its records early on sit in the state archives. Chancery Court was created by the Constitution of 1820, but it only lasted less than 2 years. It was repealed in 1822, and chancery duties fell to the circuit courts after that. So those few chancery court records are at the state archives. Then below that, you have circuit courts, which, as I mentioned, the records are at the county level in Missouri. And then there are others, which for the most part the records are at the county level. So we have county courts, which were administrative in function. There are a limited number of courts of common pleas, which kind of had overlapping duties with circuit courts and maybe a little bit the county court, probate court. Cape Girardeau had one. There was one in Hannibal. And a limited number of common pleas courts early in the history of the state. They no longer exist. Probate court, most counties had a probate court, which again, circuit courts could take on some of those duties if it was an emergency or a situation where something needed to be done when the probate court wasn't sitting. And then you also had appointed and provided for in the first state constitution and many thereafter, justices of the peace at the very local level who could hear minor disputes, usually over debt, but other things too, or trespass. And so these are probably the hardest records to find because a lot of them stayed with the individual justice of the peace and eventually were destroyed. There are a few that have survived, and you'll find those typically at the county courthouse. And then we have U.S. Circuit and District Courts in Missouri, which records sit at the National Archives branch that's appropriate for the area. We have one in Kansas City. We are in luck with some of the early court records in that you can actually access them on the State Archives website as part of the Missouri Digital Heritage. And first of all, a lot of them have been microfilmed and aren't available otherwise. You can look for those on the county records on microfilm, which I've mentioned before, but there's a link again. And you would search for, I usually just get in there for county and search for circuit or court, and it's going to tell me what they've got. I'll talk about case files later. And this is where you typically have a lot of the case files accessible, is only on microfilm or at the county courthouse in originals, but they're on microfilm at the state archives. The Judicial Records Database has quite a few local circuit court cases. It's sporadic, so again, you're not going to find everything, but occasionally you can find information about local cases in this Judicial Records Database. Even more valuable if the court case that your ancestor was involved in went to the Supreme Court, and a lot of times they were appealed because whoever had the case rule against them usually would then turn around and appeal it if they could afford to appeal it. The nice thing there is a number of these actually have digital case files. They have been digitized and they're available. So it always pays to check the surname or the name of your ancestor in the Supreme Court case records. I've found some really wonderful things. I'll show you an example later of what you can find in that Supreme Court case records database. There's an example of the for Newton County, what the circuit court case files microfilm list in part looks like. And This is where the really good stuff is. If you ever happen to have an ancestor that got sued or sued somebody in circuit court, at the very least, you're going to get a signature of that ancestor. At the most, you could get all sorts of good stuff. And there's the judicial records database. You can search by name of the party, either starts with a given series of letters or ends with it or contains that. And the year, if you know the year, I usually have to leave that blank because I don't know the precise year. What sort of action was it? I mean, you could search for divorces, and the county. And again, as I think I've mentioned before, if your ancestor was in a given county, always check the surrounding counties. And then here's the Supreme Court Historical Records Database, very similar search box, and you can search it by name. As well as you could search all the actions, like all the divorces for a given time period or a given year in a given county. Another example of a court system that is pretty interesting is Virginia. And Virginia's is very interesting because it was one of the first colonies and the court system changed so often. So it's got a very complex history, very complex evolution of the court system. You can read about it in the Family Search Wiki on Virginia courts. So they had, at the very least, you can look for county courts, the records at the Library of Virginia, which one of the first things you realize when you research Virginia is the Library of Virginia is the state archives of Virginia. Some of the records are still at the counties. District courts, the records are going to be at the Library of Virginia. Circuit courts, they're still with the counties, except for and a lot of times you'll just want the order books. High courts of chancery. These case files for many counties, well, for most counties, have been sent to the Library of Virginia, and many of them are available in digital format. Of course, none of the counties hardly that I research in have them available in digital format yet, but I dream that someday they will be. I have found a few things. So this is what the Chancery Records Index looks like for the Library of Virginia. You can select the county or you can select all counties if you're not sure. And then you can search by plaintiff, defendant, or just by surname. If you just search by surname, you're also going to pick up, they've indexed all the names that are in the case file. So you might pick up a deposition that your ancestor made for somebody else. And if you're doing research on enslaved people, you can actually limit your search to enslaved persons, a little checkbox at the bottom. Right, the steps in a typical civil case, not a criminal case, but a civil case. Let's say it's a debt case. Every step generated documents, which we hope has survived. First of all, the plaintiff had to file a declaration to get things started, and the plaintiff's lawyer, attorney would usually take that in as the opening salvo of the case. Then there would be writs of summons issued maybe for the defendant as well as potential witnesses that they wanted to call. There would be an attachment bond and defendant's judgment bond. These would be put up front in case somebody defaulted for whatever reason. There might be notices of deposition sent out. These were usually delivered by the sheriff to the individual or the sheriff's designee to the individual that was asked to give a deposition. Then you have original depositions if the case documents survived. And then if it was settled and somebody decided to appeal, they'd also have to post an appeal bond. So what types of records are generated by different types of cases? In general, there might be indexes to the cases. If there are any indexes at all, they would be by plaintiff. There might be defendants' indices. Really rarely, there might be every name indices. That is really rare. I don't run across that very often. Again, if you're really lucky, the county or the jurisdiction generated docket books. Docket books are kind of like a summary of the case from start to finish, all in one block in a book. And so you get an idea of some of these cases would drag on for years. In the docket book, you're going to be able to easily see that. Now, that being said, I haven't seen too many jurisdictions that have surviving docket books, but if they do, they're really valuable. Most have minute books. These are the summaries of what went on during the court proceedings. So it would include all sorts of other things other than just the individual cases. Then there are order books oftentimes. If you research Virginia, these are the most valuable things you're going to find is the order books, where it's partly a summary of what the court was doing, but partly a summary, mostly a summary of what the court is ordering to be done. Then you may have a final judgment book in some jurisdictions. And then most valuable of all, if they exist, is the case files, which is every little tidbit of paper that was generated by that case. And in many places, of course, courthouse fires took care of them, or they were lost in other ways. But if they survive, they're good as gold if you ever can get a hold of them. So where do I find these records? Most of us, of course, would love to have all of them online, and a lot of them are online. They may be in family search, in which case they're searched through the catalog for the county of interest. Local societies may have at least a limited number of transcriptions of some of these court records, especially minute books or order books. They may have been sent to an archives. And this is oftentimes common of case files if they've survived. And then there may be other resource pages out there that some counties, the actual court may have posted some of these old documents as well. Again, if you're lucky, there may be published transcriptions, and you can find these in libraries. That's if I'm researching a new area and I look at the card catalog for some of the libraries I can regularly access. If I see there's a transcription for that county, unless I really need the information fast, I'm going to make a note of that and just check that out next time I'm in the library, because it's certainly faster than I can do by going through page by page. That being said, it's a good idea to go through page by page because transcriptions oftentimes miss things. Minute books, again, may have indices, in which case you've got a step up. You may have to do a page-by-page search. And I cannot emphasize enough, especially with court records, keep good transcriptions, copies, or downloads for these documents. Because of all the documents we talk about, these are one of the hardest ones to have to recreate if you find out you forgot to copy something, or photograph it, or transcribe it. So do it then and keep it. Case files are available on microfilm. I showed you an example for Newton County, Missouri. They may be online, which is very rare. A lot of times they're at the courthouse. This is one of those situations where you're likely going to have to go into a really dusty, nasty part of the courthouse to look at them. They may have been sent to an archive if the courthouse ran out of room or didn't want to keep track of them. And then also, you got to think when you're down at the end of all this local research, was there an appeal? If there was an appeal, you have to do all this over again for the higher court. This photograph illustrates a typical situation in many courthouses with regard to case files. Nobody's looked at these since a clerk years ago filed them. And so they're trifolds They have to be carefully unfolded. They're usually tied up. And you just really need to take some care when you work these documents. I mentioned naturalizations in court records. Prior to September 27, 1906, any court, municipal to federal, could grant citizenship. Of course, now that is a federal responsibility. Usually an immigrant would have traveled to the closest court to be naturalized. So naturally, you're going to check the closest court first if your ancestor would have been naturalized before 1906. And that's usually the county. Most of my ancestors' naturalizations are in the county. Of course, when you go back to 1700s, it was a lot quicker process that maybe there's no record of. In the federal courts, the naturalization records are in whatever National Archives branch served the state where the person was naturalized. So there's a link to check that out if you know where your ancestor lived, or you think you know where they naturalized. As always, I have a suggested research strategy, and also as always, some of the steps in here may not be feasible, and so you just have to skip over them. So the first step should always be study the history of the court and state you're interested in. You are more likely to find your ancestor in local courts than state or federal courts, so start there. Also, know the law. Why was it in this court and not another court? You may have to delve into state law of the time to figure out what was going on. Next time we talk about probate, that's almost essential to interpret probate records, is to know the law. Next, you figured out which county it is. You've learned a little bit about the county court system. You've learned what courts existed. Look for transcribed or abstracted records for that time and place. Here, I use this one because I want to make a point about Pennsylvania courts. Bucks County, Pennsylvania Orphans Court Records. This is a transcription book. Well, you look at Orphans Court and you might think, oh, that only involves orphans. No. Orphans courts in Pennsylvania did most of the lion's share of the court duties. So the closest equivalent we'd have in many states is circuit courts. They were named our orphan courts early on and never changed names. So don't let that throw you. Make sure you know either the names are important or they really don't mean anything. I need to talk about this particular situation, but make the point first. Many cases required legal notices be published in newspapers. Check to see if the newspaper of the area where your ancestor lived is digitized and accessible to search. That being said, when this talk I put together some time ago, and a lot of times I'll just look for kind of random documents to put in here for examples. And I put this one in because it was an example of a divorce. Well, I am working on a local history column on an individual named George Calvert Yunt, who was the first Anglo to receive a Spanish or a land grant in California during Spanish times or Mexican times. And lo and behold, when I was going back through this talk the other night, I thought, holy heck, that's the guy I'm researching for the other stuff. He went west. He was cheated out of a livestock business and was bankrupt and went west trying to seek money. And he was a trapper as well. And he never came back. And his wife thought he'd abandoned her, so she sued for divorce and was granted a divorce. And here it is. And you'll notice also it says in Chancery. That means the Howard County Circuit Court was sitting in Chancery because divorce was considered something that was unequitable treatment. So it's in Chancery to do this. So I just thought that was interesting that Serendipity sometimes comes into play. Well, next step, if you can't find it in a newspaper, is start with the index books. The earliest ones are, if they're indexed, are by plaintiff only. After 1840, some places started to pick up and do defendant indices. Some of these are in Family Search. Some of them are elsewhere online. Others you may have to work with a local researcher or county courthouse or go to an archives where they might be microfilmed. If your ancestor appears, search for the indexed court records or verify published versions against the original and find the case file number. That's very important if you ever want to get to the case file, if it still exists, you need the number. Although not always, sometimes they were filed by the plaintiff's name. Still be handy to have the case number. And this one is number 663 for St. Genevieve County Circuit Court. Next step, then, you've got the case number, or you've figured out where the case files are, and happily they still exist. Access them. Some are in Family Search or digitized elsewhere. I think a few may be on Ancestry. Others are microfilmed, and many are just available as the originals, and you would have to go to the, again, the dirty part of the courthouse oftentimes to find them. Next step, again, is one that frequently you're not going to be able to do because these are relatively uncommon, but examine docket books using the dates for the beginning and closing for the case file to determine if you missed something that may not be in the case file. They didn't get all the documents put in the case file for a variety of reasons. If you can't find a case file or docket book reference, search the bound volumes of documents. Depending on where you are, these may be in minute books, order books, or settlement books. Read the minutes. Sometimes the most incredible things are in that one little sentence buried in the middle of a vast sea of handwriting. If there is no index, you will have to search page by page for the case in the minute, order, settlement, or other book. Also, the entire time, all the documents, be alert for evidence of an appeal, or sometimes they would settle by arbitration. Now, I want to back off and talk a little bit right now about a lot of this may involve courthouse research, and I've talked a little bit about courthouse research before, but I want to remind you about how to conduct courthouse research to get the most return. First of all, always call in advance. You want to figure out which office, circuit clerk, typically in Missouri for circuit court records, but you never know where they might have been stored. They may say, oh, the case files, they're often County Historical Society on loan. And that's, a mile away from the courthouse in this building. And they're only open Tuesdays from noon to 4. So you'll need to know that. So by calling, you'll find that out. Determine what records are available and where. Again, they may be in different parts of the courthouse from where the office that controls them is. You might want to contact a local researcher or society for pointers and where to go. If somebody were to come to me about circuit court case files for Cape Girardeau County, Missouri, I'd say, don't go to the courthouse. You need to go to the County Archive Center because they've all been moved there. And they can help you better than the circuit clerk anyway. Determine if copies and photos are allowable. Hopefully digital photos, that's becoming kind of the standard now. Ask about any hour restrictions and restrictions like We have to be with you when you're doing the research. One courthouse I worked in didn't allow you to bring in even a cell phone, much less a computer. So always ask about restrictions like that. Ask about parking and security restrictions. Is there a metal detector at the door? Do I need to leave all metal items in the car other than my car keys? So you need to know that in advance rather than be surprised. Remember, the staff is not there to answer your questions or to help you with research related to genealogy. They may not know. They might know their records, but they don't know what's in them oftentimes. Prepare to get dirty and work in less than ideal settings. All right, I want to spend the rest of the time giving you some examples of what you can find in court records. This is from a minute book in Virginia, in Franklin County. Actually, it's in the will book, even though it was a court action, which goes to show you you're going to find court actions in a lot of different places other than the ones I've talked about. So obviously, most people, if they're going to research a person, they're going to look in the will book if they think maybe they died there. And indeed, Peter Gerhardt Sr., I don't think he died here, but he was here a good long while. This is the results of an inquest, somebody of circumstances. So they did the inquest at Peter Gerhardt's, and it's 1789. And the coroner was there. And they're looking into the cause of death of John Gerhardt, infant. Infant was a term, we generally think of it as a baby. Infant was a term that for many years in the US meant an individual under age 21 if they were male. And upon the oath of James Skamer, Peter Gerhardt, John Henry Gerhardt, and Abram Gerhardt. Let's go to where what happened here was these people were all together. They were brothers and father, and probably a couple other people. It looks to me like they were probably getting ready to go hunting or some other activity. And they were in the house, and apparently John Gerhardt was loading the gun or had loaded the gun, and it went off for whatever reason and shot him in the head. And that's, I mean, you think about that right in front of your brothers and your father. And especially when I think Peter Gerhardt was my direct ancestor. So this was one of my however many greats uncles that met his demise by an accidental gunshot wound. So again, you never know what you'll find. Here's another example of a situation where order books exist but are not indexed. And so I had to go page by page. And this is Pocahontas County, West Virginia. So I got on Family Search and looked for Pocahontas County, West Virginia, and then found court records. And here we go. And found order books. And I just started, I knew when my ancestors were in Pocahontas County, I would need to go through volumes 1 and 2 primarily. And so I start looking for the surnames. I was looking for Deaver or Devers or some variant thereof. Townsend and Bird were the surnames I was looking for. And I start looking, and when I do this scan, initially what I'm doing is I'm just looking for the surname, and I record page numbers and then just keep going. And then I go back later and read what they involved. So in this case, June 1822. This is a boundary for a constable's district. So it's a constable appointment. And it turns out my ancestor's house was right on the boundary, James Deaver. Okay, that's interesting. So what? Well, it also mentions potentially some other people that were near there. So if you get stuck, you're going to research friends, associates, and neighbors. So here's a great way to get associates. Next was a last will and testament, and one ancestor was proved will and witnessed it, and another ancestor was appointed to appraise the estate. And just to give you a clue, at least I say William Deaver was an ancestor. I don't know for sure if he was an elder William Deaver or a younger William Deaver. I suspect a younger. James Deaver was definitely my ancestor. This William may have been. So what have I got there? I've got more associates. And when I look at these names, Tallman, Havens, Collins, these are all names that, and May, pop up repeatedly in association with these Deavers in Bath County, Virginia, and in the part that became Pocahontas County, West Virginia. And you can see for the rest of them, I've got page numbers, and I'm going to go back and transcribe what's mentioned about these ancestors at each page number. Yes, it takes time, but then occasionally you find something like this. We're still on Deavers. This James Deaver's father was John Deaver, and he died in Belmont County, Ohio. Just to give you an example, this is a chancery record from Ohio. Why chancery? Somebody was treated inequitably. As it turns out, John Deaver had promised his son, I think it was Jonathan, promised his grandsons, Jonathan's sons and daughter, that he would leave them land at his death. And then he did not follow through. They had witnesses to that. So everybody sued everybody else when John Deaver died because these grandchildren didn't get their land. And not only that, they not only sued everybody, but it listed where everybody lived and how they're related to John Deaver. So we've got George Deaver in Jackson County, Ohio. John Van Pelt and Mary Van Pelt in Highland County, Ohio. Robert Willis and Sarah in Belmont County, Ohio. Abram Deaver in Clinton County, Ohio. James Deaver, my ancestor, in Bath County, Virginia. John Deaver in Scioto County, Ohio. Wow, wonderful stuff. And then where the children of Jonathan Deaver were living. So this is one of the best court records I think I've ever found, because it just lists where all those heirs lived and how they were related. Now, unfortunately, Deavers tended to reuse the same names over and over and over again, but I do know at least where certain ones lived at a certain time. Here's another one where it's an interaction into somebody's personality, I think. John Dunn was purported to be one of the larger slave owners, and well, that's true. He was one of the larger slave owners in Cape Girardeau County, and he was purported to be a pretty hard character. And this kind of backs that up. There was a lawsuit after he died saying that he had deeded 2 slaves to 2 of his daughters at a certain point. And they were suing because they didn't get those slaves, and the administrator of the estate didn't allow them those slaves, and they were suing. And the situation was, Dunn had a deed to that effect. He never had it recorded. He still had it at a certain point. You can almost see through what was going on here. They were arguing about this, apparently. And so these two daughters were there, and then John Donne asked this witness that gave this testimony here to let, he wanted to look at it, and she surrendered it to him. Wait a minute. Yeah, and John Donne took it away, handed it to one of his slaves and said, throw it in the fire. And she did. The slave threw it in the fire, and it was toast. And they lost the case because there's no physical evidence anymore. He did negotiate this deed, and then he burned it. So tells me that he was probably had quite a temper and was just irritated to death of his two daughters arguing about this, and just said, oh, the heck with it, burn the deed. You can also get relationships in some case file documents. And this is an individual called John Risher. And he had a debt when he left Pennsylvania with a brother-in-law, never paid the debt. Brother-in-law sued. The circuit court in Cape Girardeau County found against Risher, and he appealed it to the Supreme Court. So there's a case file in the Supreme Court database on the State Archives website. But in one of the depositions, Risher says he didn't think it was necessary to have an actual written debt. And actually, I think the brother-in-law borrowed from him. He thought, well, we trusted each other, so we didn't have to have a piece of writing. Well, it just goes to show you get it in writing. And he talks about moving from Pennsylvania to Upper Louisiana in probably 1804 or 1805, and then going back to Pennsylvania to Pittsburgh in 1805, and trying to collect from his brother-in-law at that time. So we get a narrow down on John Risher came to Missouri, probably 1804, 1805, just from these documents. There's the transcription. So that's just some examples of what you can find in court records. Again, there's a steep learning curve every time you move to a new state or a new county to learn about what's in the records. But if you figure this out and you can access the records, and they still exist, you will find that oftentimes court records will be incredibly rewarding.
Bill, thank you again for another great talk.